Have you ever woken at midnight certain the house was listening? I did, and the sound that answered me wasn't wind or pipes. It was a slow, deliberate knock that knew my name. It came from beneath the floorboards, from the place everyone in town pretended didn't exist anymore. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 32 years old. The night I'm telling you about happened on October 13th, 2019. I was an electrician by trade and practical to a fault, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once. I grew up in Redwater Hollow, a small town where Main Street had one diner, a drugstore with a cracked neon sign, and a courthouse clock that hadn't told correct time in years. People in Redwater Hollow liked their routines and their polite distance from one another's business. There are characters in every small town who feel like furniture, always present, quietly worn. June Whitlock was one of those. A retired teacher who baked pies and could remember everyone's grandmother. Sheriff Tom Lang had the look of a man who'd never left the county line. He did not scare easily. My childhood friend Noah Granger still lived in town, coaching the high school team and telling stories that grew taller with every beer. Then there was Caleb Donnelly, the developer who bought the old Worthington place with plans and a sharp suit. Marjorie White, who called herself the project's historian, liked things preserved as if their preservation could fix time. The Worthington house sat on a slight rise at the edge of town. Built in the late 1800s, it had turrets, flaking paint, and a porch that dipped on one side like a tired shoulder. Town folklore had wrapped itself around that house. The Worthington patriarch, Arthur, ran a grain mill. His wife, Lillian, was said to walk the property at night, talking to someone unseen. Kids dared each other to peek through the windows. Teenagers used the rear yard for secrets. To the adults, it was a blemish on the landscape, a conversation the town had stopped finishing. I didn't go into the Worthington house because I believed in ghosts. I went because Caleb hired me to inspect and rewire the place before contractors moved in. That was the kind of work that paid the bills and kept my hands busy. On my first day there, I measured old beams and checked junction boxes. Marjorie insisted we preserve crown moldings and muttered about keeping Lillian's parlor intact. Mrs. Whitlock brought me a thermos of coffee and a recipe, and warned me with a smile to be respectful of old places. Work days in the house were ordinary. I climbed, crawled, and mapped wires. Sometimes the old house groaned like buildings do, and sometimes a draft rearranged a curtain. I kept a radio on low and my toolbox close. At night, I went back to a rented bungalow on Oak Street, where a cat named June curled in my lap. My life felt steady. Bills, visits to my sister in Minneapolis, and plans I could make and keep. Redwater Hollow itself had a history of small disasters. A flood in 1978, the mill closing, a strike that left old grudges. People told those stories as if they were weather reports. They softened the edges of the town's memory. I learned to listen to the hum of the place, to respect its rituals. For weeks, the Worthington job was routine. Then in early October, rumors started. Workers reported tools moved, a photograph gone missing, a whisper in a room where no one stood. Caleb shrugged and blamed mice. I kept to my list and told myself not to be dramatic. On the morning of October 13th, I left my bungalow with my lunch, my toolbox, and the radio. The sky was low and thin. The town seemed to hold its breath. I had no reason to expect the ordinary to break open the way it did. I was practical, grounded, and convinced that any explanation would have an explanation of its own. I had no idea how wrong I was. That night, the house stopped being a project and became a presence. The knocks started beneath my boots, insistent and patient, as if someone were composing a name from rhythms. I found the cellar hatch nailed and weathered. When I forced it open, the air that rose smelled ancient. The basement was a small world. Buckets, a broken kettle, a child's rag doll half buried in dust. Against the far wall, a patch of floor looked newer, as if someone had taken care to replace boards only where they wanted to. I pried up those boards and revealed a trapdoor cunningly hidden and fitted to lie flush with the flooring. A breath of colder air rose from below, and a narrow ladder led to a low passage. The light on my headlamp caught plaster flecked with old wallpaper, and at the passage's end, a single wooden table holding a leather-bound journal. Lillian Worthington's handwriting filled the pages. At first, it was ordinary. Then the lines curled into pleas and fragments. Entries about late-night visitors who came in capes of fog, about bargains whispered beneath the elm, and about a promise to keep a particular doorway closed for all of our sakes. The last dated entry was October 12, 1913, and the ink there had been scraped as if by frantic hands. Folded between pages, I found a faded toy shoe and a child's sketch, a crooked house with a circle and dot inked in the corner. When I brought the journal upstairs, the house changed the way a room can change when someone else enters. The air tightened and the radio hissed. In the static, a syllable threaded itself clear, my name. I called Sheriff Lang, and he came with his flashlight and a careful expression. He peered into the crawl space, frowned, and told me to board the place and wait for investigators. His jaw was tight in a way that made me think he believed more than he wanted to say. That night, the courthouse clock, frozen for years, began to toll in the dead hours with a deep, impossible note. The sounds moved from floor to wall to ceiling, spreading like ink across the house's bones. A voice hummed a lullaby from somewhere within the walls, warped and wrong, and on the mantel a smear of dust spelled a name in shaky capitals, Lillian. The town's response was naughty and human. Mrs. Whitlock came by with preserves and a face that said she'd been waiting for an account to match what she'd been holding in her throat for decades. "We know," she said quietly, "but knowing does not make it lighter." Caleb offered to halt renovations. The admission tasted like defeat. Old photographs surfaced showing children and a woman on the porch, smiling in a small, brittle way. Rumors of bargains and losses breathed through conversations at the diner. Days pulled at a tired thread. I slept poorly, and sometimes not at all. I began to see the house in daylight as a body that had been experimented upon. Boards cut and replaced, rooms bricked over, a paired section in the foundation where the crawl space hooked to something older. Lillian's journal suggested that the family had made a promise to keep something contained beneath the floors, a pact sealed with tokens and names. The tokens had been disturbed. People in town began to report the same odd things. Dreams of a woman in an old dress standing at a field's edge, a pup that refused to cross the Worthington yard, a parish meeting canceled because someone needed to pray privately. A teenager left a disposable camera on the porch and found the film blank where the house should have been. A neighbor admitted to finding a child's shoe and tucking it away in a box marked lost. One night, too proud or too stubborn to stay away, I returned with a flashlight and a recorder. The recorder picked up a tapping pattern, then a whisper that said, "We kept our end." My flashlight beam settled on the child's sketch and the circle and dot again, and logic braided with a raw, old fear. A ledger of promises kept and perhaps a price paid. Eventually, Redwater Hollow adapted the way small towns do. Some argued for demolition, others left offerings on the porch and said prayers aloud. Sheriff Lang arranged a rotation of neighbors to check the property, and the developer stopped work. People built a polite distance around the place like a fence of superstition and habit. I left Redwater Hollow 2 months later. I photocopied the journal and carried that copy with me when I drove away. Sleep returned slowly, but at odd hours in a new town and under the hum of a different streetlight, I still hear a slow, deliberate knock that knows my name, and I remember a child's drawing with its circle and dot. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. Have you ever driven home and felt the whole town watching you back, as if every dark window hid a secret only your eyes could find? The night I came back to Ashfield, I felt those eyes against my neck, and something waited on my porch. I still remember cold. My name is Daniel Ward. I'm 34 years old, and this happened on October 12th, 2019. I still remember the date because the air smelled like wet leaves and old diesel. I grew up in Ashfield, a 3-stoplight town where everybody knew your bicycle brand and your grandmother's funeral history. It was the kind of place where directions were given by porches and the names of trees. I had moved back after 10 years away, convinced small towns were gentle by default. I was wrong. Before you meet the thing that broke our routine, you need to know the players. Sheriff Tom Lang had a voice that could calm a storm. He'd inherited the badge from his father and kept a neat row of law books in the trunk of his cruiser. My neighbor, Rita Lane, ran the diner on Route 9 and kept pies on the sill like currency. My best friend was Lucas Bennett, a soft-spoken electrician who could climb a maple blindfolded. And then there was Evelyn Marsh, who taught first grade and knew everyone's middle names by heart. Ashfield looked like a postcard. A white church with a bell that only rang for weddings, a general store that smelled of tobacco and cinnamon, a mill pond that froze into mirrors. But under the postcard, people carried histories like lead weights. The mill had closed in 2008. Half the town took antidepressants, swore it wasn't necessary. There were houses with porch swings that creaked, and empty lots where children used to build forts. Stories clung to the place. Legends of a vanished boy in the 70s, whispers about the old bridge, and a rumor that the mill owner had buried money under the orchard. All of that made the town cozy and strange at the same time. I moved back to care for my father after he got sick. He'd once been a high school shop teacher who could fix anything with an angle grinder and patience. When he died, I stayed because grief has gravity, and because there's comfort in a place that remembers your childhood scars. I rented the Parson House on Hollow Road. It was nearly identical to the house I grew up in, but quieter. My days were simple. Mornings at the hardware store, evenings at Rita's Diner, weekends taking apart lawnmowers like a hobby and putting them together again. There were early warnings, tiny contextual things that made my skin tighten. A mailbox left closed that my neighbor insisted she'd opened. A stray dog that watched certain houses and wouldn't meet my eyes. Notes left on porches with phrases like, "not yours," scrawled in a hand that trembled. People explained them away. Teenagers, pranksters, stray pets. In a town like Ashfield, rumor is a tidal current, and everyone floats along until something drags them under. I want to be honest, I'm not a brave man by nature. I like to fix the obvious and keep the peace. But there was a night in October when ordinary fear became a skill. I was returning from the hardware store later than usual because Lucas and I had been installing a generator at the Caldwell farmhouse. The road to my house skirts the mill pond and winds through a stand of maples that make a tunnel of shadows at night. As I rounded the bend, I drove past the Barton place. The Barton place had been empty since Mrs. Barton passed away, and the town had always assumed the house would fall to rot before anyone would claim it. Someone had started leaving a chair on that porch, a wooden rocker facing the road. That night, the rocker had a coat draped over it, and someone had left a pair of muddy boots beside the step. I slowed the truck out of a mixture of curiosity and a sense that I'd seen the edges of something I shouldn't. I parked and walked closer. The coat's collar stood up like it had been stuffed with straw. In the dim glow, there was something tucked into the jacket pocket. An old photograph, the kind developed from film. It was of me at 11, crooked smile, gap-toothed, holding a salamander by the pond. My stomach did a small, sick loop. I didn't know how anyone could have that photo. I folded it back into the pocket and felt, in that instant, like the town had given me a summons. I could have left then. I could have driven straight home and locked my door, told myself this was petty, a child's game, a prank. But Ashfield is a place where stories don't stay quiet. They echo. I took the photograph to Rita, who looked at it and then at me, and for the first time in years, her hands stopped moving. That night, more voices joined the small chorus of unease. Lucas with a story about tools misplaced in his van, Evelyn with an offhand comment about someone whistling under her classroom window at dusk. Sheriff Lang knocked on my door at the edge of midnight. He wore a cap and the expression of a man who's learned the hard lesson that small towns sometimes hide large cruelty. He told me there had been break-ins on the outskirts, nothing violent but invasive. Items taken, photographs rearranged, things purloined in ways that suggested someone was cataloging memory rather than goods. The investigation the next week was mostly manual, door-to-door questions, flashlights sweeping hedgerows, the town holding its breath. No CCTV, no big city forensics, just notebooks and neighborhood memory. People started locking things that hadn't been locked in generations. Windows were left open in the day and shuttered by night. A meeting was held in the church basement where coffee cups trembled uneasily and hands argued about whether newcomers or old ghosts were to blame. Then, 3 nights after the photograph, something happened that changed the way we understood stalking. My father's shed, the padlock had been twisted but not opened. Inside, among tools in the cedar chest, someone had left a child's red scarf, the same scarf I remember from a winter fair in 1994. It was placed carefully on the workbench, folded like a prayer. The air smelled of sawdust and bleach. That moment made it clear. This wasn't random. Whoever was doing this was reaching into our pasts and laying our memories out to be inspected. Now I'll tell you exactly what happened the night the small town stopped being small in my life, and how the thing that watched from porches turned out to be less a ghost and more a person with a patient hunger. It was the deep, quiet hour when the crickets quit and the world felt made of glass. I followed footprints into the mill yard, found evidence, confronted a neighbor I trusted, and learned how grief can become dangerous. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Daniel Wickham, I'm 32, and the night everything changed was October 12th, 2018. But the question that haunted me afterward was simple and savage. How do you leave a town that insists you never left? What do you do when the place that raised you becomes the thing that erases you? I tell this as plainly as I can because people like tidy endings, and small towns never hand those out. Marblewood was the kind of place with a single blinking stoplight, a diner that smelled like coffee and grief, and porches where old men measured time by who came to call. It sat in a pocket of northern road and pines, a place most maps almost forgot. I had grown up there. Baseball games under sodium lamps, Friday night parades, and the kind of neighborly favors that meant you borrowed sugar and secrets in the same breath. Characters in small towns are always larger than their faults. Lena Brooks, who ran the florist and doubled as the unofficial mayor, she had an easy laugh and a stack of receipts that never balanced. Sheriff Amos Dalton was a broad-shouldered man who'd known my father and every crooked route in town. He had a face that could settle a room. Then there was my sister, Emily, 2 years younger, quick as a match and just as dangerous if you struck her the wrong way. People assumed I was steady because I came back after college to take over my grandfather's garage, the sort of place where oil-stained hands were proof of character. The plot, believe me, unspooled like a cheap movie at first. A missing dog, a fight at the bar, a road washed out after a storm. But small towns hold stories like water holds stones. Each ripple reveals something under the surface. There were whispers about the old Whitaker house on Hollow Ridge. Teenagers dared one another to touch its weathered porch, while parents pretended they didn't know. The Whitaker house had belonged to a man named Harold Whitaker, who ran the town's paper mill decades earlier. He died quietly, people said, but houses keep memories, and Marblewood's houses were hoarders. I wasn't looking for trouble on October 12th. I was fixing a rusted muffler in my garage, thinking about bills and my sister's stubborn grin when Lena drove up with a wild look in her eyes. "There's something wrong down by the ridge," she said without slowing. "You should come." Lena's voice was the kind that could turn polite gossip into a summons. I wiped my hands and followed her. On the way, we passed Sheriff Dalton on his porch, lighting a cigarette, and he tipped his hat the way men do when they want to look like they know more than they will say. The town had been dry of anything bigger than minor crime for years. People drank to dull, small regrets, not to hide from big ones. That night, the moon leaned low, a sickle over pine needles, and the air tasted of rain yet to fall. We walked the path that led to the Whitaker property, and the yard was a map of neglect. Rusted toys, a swing with a rope eaten by weather, and, oddly, fresh footprints in the soft dirt leading from the back porch toward the woods. The footprints were human and small, like a child's, and they trailed away in a line too purposeful for an animal. My stomach dropped like a coin in a well. "Emily was out looking for her," Lena whispered. "She said she heard music coming from the old place." Music. That simple word held me fast. The Whitaker place had been boarded up for years. No electricity, no reason for music. I remember thinking of the town's kids, trouble and midnight dares, and then I remembered Emily wasn't reckless like that. She was reckless in private. She had been stubbornly searching for a life outside Marblewood, and the town's smallness seemed to press on her like a hand over a mouth. We found her phone on a porch step, screen cracked but still warm as if she had only left moments before. The last text was from me. "You coming home for dinner?" It was stupid, a message about meatloaf and small talk. and then an unread reply that never arrived. Lena and I called out, our voices small against the trees, until Sheriff Dalton's torch found the path and the search grew official. The town woke in a way that small towns do when thin curtains are pulled back. Quickly, quietly, with that awful neighborly efficiency of people turning up with casseroles and candles. For the first 500 words of this story, I'm supposed to set the table, introduce you to the players, and explain why a place that looks so tame could turn cruel. That's the careful part. If you've been in a small town, you know the rest of it feels inevitable. The sheriff you'd expect to have answers, the old house that shouldn't hold a secret this loud, the way families keep each other's stories because lives are safer that way. But the main thing I needed to tell you before the real part started was this. Marblewood had rules, and none of them were written down. People didn't pry too much into neighbors' nights. Things happened and were bowed into silence, like broken things swept under rugs. The town's kindness had edges. After that, after the polite concern and the search parties, the main story begins. The night I went looking alone, and the town seemed to change on me. We had a break in the search at 2 a.m. when rain finally came, soft and patient. Sheriff Dalton called off the official sweep because the woods were slick and dangerous. But I couldn't stop thinking of Emily's small footprints, of the music. Around 3, I drove my truck toward Hollow Ridge, headlights cutting thin ribbons through mist, the town muffled behind me. People sleep in little towns like Marblewood, but fear doesn't sleep. It stakes out of bed and refuses the covers. I parked under the ridge and climbed barefoot toward the Whitaker porch. The air smelled like wet leaves and something else, a smell that was metallic, like pennies on a tongue. I shouldn't have been there. I shouldn't have been anywhere without other people. But fear does odd arithmetic. Alone, you are both more careful and more reckless. On the porch, the door hung slightly ajar, and inside, the darkness seemed to be breathing. There were framed pictures on the wall, faces frozen in sepia, and under them a faint stain on the floor that looked disturbingly fresh. Then I heard the music. Low, a childlike tune played slow on an instrument I couldn't place. It came from the basement, thin as a thread, and it made the hair on my arms stand up like the teeth of a comb. I went down. Basements are where small towns hide what they can't tell their porches about. The Whitaker basement had been used to store whatever the mill didn't take. Barrels, old furniture, and right in the center, a circle of objects arranged with the care of someone composing a list of debts. Dolls with button eyes, old coins, and a recorder, a simple plastic recorder, the kind kids learn to make shrill music on, lay in the circle. The recorder was wet, and when I picked it up, my hands trembled. And then I saw her. Emily was there, curled in a corner, not bound but not free either, eyes wide and luminous like a deer trapped in headlights. She didn't speak at first. Her lips formed words slowly, like someone reacquainting themselves with language. "They told me it would fix things," she said finally. "They said Marblewood remembers." I thought. From the doorway, I could see shapes standing at the foot of the steps. Neighbors. Not all of them, but enough of them to make what I saw make sense and feel impossible. Lena was there, cheeks pale and wet. Sheriff Dalton's jaw had tightened, as if he had been tasked with swallowing something he could not. The circle in the basement smelled not of incense, but of something older. The way a town breathes its own history into a room. People had come to the Whitaker house not to harm, at least not in the terms we'd used before, but because the town had decided it needed a reset. Their voices were small, murmurings barely above breath. They spoke of bargains and old promises about debts made when the mill fed the town and the millmen signed contracts with pens tipped in desperation. I didn't understand it then. Who does, when the world you grew up in rearranges its furniture and asks you to pay for the new upholstery with a child's silence? Emily had been lured, perhaps by curiosity, perhaps by a version of mercy that only looks like mercy from within. They'd tried to stitch something back into the town's memory with ritual and a recorder, calling the past to order. She had been a vessel for that attempt, and vessels leak. I grabbed her hand, and for a moment, the whole room seemed to hinge on that simple contact. The neighbors didn't move at first, as if they'd forgotten the difference between what they were and what they were doing. Then Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, his face taut. "Not like this," he said. Not to me, but as if he were speaking to an answer with no mouth. He helped me lift Emily to her feet. She moved like someone waking from anesthesia. We left Hollow Ridge at dawn, a strange procession of people who had done something and would later make excuses for it. The town had tried, in a way only towns can, to fix itself by reaching back into memory and pulling strings. The strings frayed. The music stopped. In the weeks that followed, there were conversations that went on porches and in basements, apologies stitched into casseroles, and a silence that sat between neighbors like a dog that won't leave the room. Marblewood didn't change overnight. Towns rarely do, but the ledger had been altered. People who had once smiled with ease now kept their smiles measured. Sheriff Dalton retired quietly after the town decided it had been enough, or not enough. Lena moved her shop to a neighboring county. Emily and I left a month later, the garage sold to a man who liked the smell of motor oil. When I tell people now that it was a true story, they want proof, names, court records, a neat prosecutable thread. The truth is smaller and larger. A night when neighbors became something else, when a place that felt safe decided to be dangerous in the name of saving itself. You can't always prosecute a town's conscience. You can only leave and watch its lights grow distant. This is not an explanation so much as a confessional. Small towns keep secrets because they think secrets are shelter. Sometimes those secrets are sheltering, sometimes they are cages. I carry the memory of music, the recorder's wet plastic, and my sister's hand in mine like a talisman. I left Marblewood, but sometimes at night I still hear a thin tune through the walls of whatever apartment I rent, and I wonder what towns will ask of me next. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.